Hello, 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 friends. Welcome to the space. Welcome to Cultivate Your Mental Wealth. As you know, my name is Joyce O. I'm a civil rights attorney. I am also a mental health advocate with lived experience with depression and anxiety specifically. So when I'm talking about cultivating your mental wealth and going from places of mental burnout to mental freedom and places of mental abundance, I am speaking from personal experience. My friends, this is so possible for all of us. And in this space, we talk about how to get mentally well for ourselves and how to live in abundance and in the overflow for our communities. I also want to preview today's show. I have missed talking to y'all, so it's so good to be here again. I want to say that we are continuing our series on boundaries. For those of you who have been following, we've talked about boundaries with friends today, boundaries with family before, and we also talked about boundaries at your place of employment if you were tuning in 2 weeks ago. But today, boundaries with friends. I have a special guest. I have the Dr. Rhonda Maddox on the show. Please give her a virtual round of applause. We will be talking about boundaries with a friend. Speaking of friends, hi, friend. Hi.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
It's always a privilege to have you on the show. And I want to underscore, I know I call you friend, I call you mentor, all of the above, but let's not get it twisted. Dr. Rhonda is a board certified psychiatrist. She's a media consultant. She's a coach, a speaker, an author, a mother, a wife, so much more. And she's also the BDO host of I'm Not Crazy, But. If you've seen her show, you've probably seen me on it a few times. So it's good that you're returning the favor. Thank you again and welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We also want to do audience check ins at this time. Where are you tuning in from? And what are some questions about boundaries with friends that you may have? Are some of y'all scared about that terminology, boundaries with friends and how to set them? Let us know in the comment section what your questions are. I guarantee that we will go back and look at each of your comments and respond one on one. But if you may not want to comment publicly, we've also set up a specific email for this show, and that is comethrive247 at gmail.com. That's comethrive247 at gmail.com. In that email, you can ask me questions one on one, and I promise I will give you a free consultation and follow up for those of you who I consider my family in this space. Comethrive247 at gmail.com for your questions on boundaries with friends, families, and everything else we've discussed in the series. Okay, so before we get into the meat of our conversation, I like to do what we've come to call setting the room for this space. Let's set the room. In this space, we have conversations around mental illness and, more importantly, mental wellness and how to get to places of safety, well-being, and abundance. I want you to know that I may be talking to you a lot in this show. We may have guests as we have today, but this is our conversation and this is our space. You are safe, you are seen, you are valued, and you are heard in this space. So actively participate as you can because this is your conversation too. Okay, friends, so let's get into the meat of what we're here to talk about. Let's thrive, let's talk. We've discussed, as I said, boundaries with families. That was on I'm Not Crazy, But, and it was a really robust conversation, right, Doc?
Yes.
And 2 weeks ago, we were talking about how do you set boundaries in your workplace. Please go back and check out both of those episodes because it was as rewarding to discuss it as it must have been to be listening in. So you have not missed out permanently if you weren't able to catch it when it aired. But today, we're talking about probably relationships that affect everyone. Not everyone may be close to their families, not everyone may get into a romantic relationship, but everyone at some point has considered at least one person to be their friends. So this is applicable to all of us as living beings. We were created for community. We actually thrive in community. So we need to know how to navigate that community, what I call your chosen community, not your blood, but the people that you choose to call your friends. So first, we want to consider, and this is going to be kind of conversational. We'll be going back and forth, talking from our own experience, talking from our expertise, but boundaries with friends in our relationships. Why is it important to set boundaries with friends, and why do we need to move with that type of intention in our friendships? Dr. Maddox, you can start it off, and I can share some of my ideas about why it is important at all to set boundaries with our friends.
I think we're all different, and what we find acceptable is what we find acceptable. And many times we project and think others are in alignment with us. But when you set the boundaries, and for me, setting boundaries is about having conversations that I conduct when I'm not in the heat of the moment, when I'm not angry, but I am intentional about when I have some of these conversations. And I am saying to you, this is the way that I'm able to navigate this relationship in a healthy way and have a meaningful exchange with you. If you cross these boundaries, then this is what happens.
Yeah.
And you're having this conversation not with resentment, not with bitterness. I think a part of the issue that the reason it can be difficult is because many times we're learning in real time what's okay with us and what's not, right?
Yeah.
I don't know to tell you, don't knock this chip off my shoulder, because this never occurred to me that you would try to knock the chip off my shoulder. But when
Okay.
you do, I think, wait a minute, you know? And so some of us will go back and we will ruminate and we will think, oh my gosh, am I overreacting? And then we'll talk to 17 people about it rather than have the conversation with the person. And if we don't say something, we ruminate, we get angry, we get resentful. And then by the time we say something, it's
Yeah.
when we could have had the conversation much earlier and set the ground rules so that we can decide, is this something that I want to continue?
Yeah, I love what you're saying. You kind of are projecting into the future about why it can be difficult sometimes. And I can't wait to get into that part of our talk. But boundaries are important in friendship, like Dr. Wanda said, because they set the ground rules. They help manage expectations, which is one of my favorite terms. A lot of the times when we're disappointed in our relationships with our friends, oftentimes we haven't done a very good job at managing our own expectations and managing the expectations of that person with whom we're in relationship or friendship with. So boundaries are important because it's kind of the playbook that we use to help us
Right.
interact with each other. And I think it's also important for our own emotional independence. Emotional independence. I'm sure that's a phrase that's come up in your work, but what I mean by that, some of these friendships, and y'all can relate, some of these friendships that we celebrate and that we glorify are friendships that we made when we didn't even fully understand who we are or who we
Yes.
were, right? I think about the friendships that people I'm still friends with, some people that I've had to walk away from that I made when I was 17 years old. 17. That's a baby in my book. I don't care if in Illinois it's like the age of consent. You are a child when you're making some of these long lasting relationships. So when you don't set boundaries per season in the beginning or just as things are going, you don't get a chance to learn what your own emotional independence looks like. And what I mean when I say emotional independence, I mean your ability to navigate how the relationship affects you, independent of that person and whether they're going to be your friend or whether they're going to be mad at you. But learning how to express your needs with another person and building yourself up so that you can validate those needs yourself, the things that you need from that other person. So, what are your thoughts on emotional independence, or just more of the significance that boundary setting with friends gives to you as an individual.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to back it up just a little bit
Yeah.
because when when we're developing relationships in childhood at 17, many times we're still in the home with our parents. And
Yeah.
if you were reared in a home like mine, children were to be seen and not heard. Now we're in a different age now. And so now children get to have a voice. But when I was growing up, children were to be seen and not heard. And so we didn't get to articulate our feelings, our emotions, or it was not safe for us to do so. It was not safe for us to even perhaps express how we felt on our face. Forget about saying anything. If you would be chided to fix your face. So
Yeah.
we didn't even have an opportunity to express dissatisfaction in our households. And now all of a sudden, at 17, at 18, we're supposed to go into the world and we're supposed to identify what's okay for us and what's not okay when we've not grown up being able to use our voice. So now at 18, we have this emotional freedom, but many times in our homes, we've witnessed people get shut down because they dare to dissent,
Hmm.
and that's scary. We have witnessed people call us names, stupid, lazy, whatever, because we dared to dissent, many of us. And now we're supposed to dissent and say, I'm not okay with that. That feels really, really uncomfortable. And so you have this inner conflict. Is this relation, if I say something, will they behave like my parents or my siblings? Is this relationship more important to me than myself? Because if you don't establish a boundary, it's like a violation of your conscience.
Yeah.
And then you start to resent because you've not been true to yourself. To thine own self be true. And if we push things down and we don't set the boundaries, we're not honoring ourselves and we're not being true to ourselves. At this point, I do not know if I've answered your question.
You have, and it's like this honor of self. And I kind of want to get into that if we have more time later on, because this honor of self is a conversation that I believe has become more popular in recent times in the modern era. Live your truth and honor yourself. I personally do not believe that truth is subjective. I believe that truth is only objective. I believe you can live your own experience,
Mhm.
but not everyone, and that experience can be true to you. But I sometimes buck up against this self, 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 self. It sounds obsessive to me.
Mm,
And then it gets difficult when you reconcile that with spirituality and this idea that we're supposed to sacrifice for others.
mm,
I identify as Christian. So honoring myself, but I'm supposed to be serving and sacrificing for others.
mm,
Sometimes it makes it difficult to set boundaries in relationships and friendships because you're trying to reconcile this not being obsessed with yourself and ego while also serving this person that you love, that you're friends with, but also wanting to honor yourself and respect yourself, but not trying to toe the line. So we're going to get into how do we reconcile ourselves with service and friendships? How do we protect ourselves in a way that doesn't feel selfish? What do we call selfish and why? There's just so much to unpack there. But I want to go back to what you're saying about being true in a relationship, because another reason why boundaries and friendships is important, it deepens the bond. It makes for a more meaningful relationship. I'll tell you something about myself. It's really hard for me to meet a stranger. How many of y'all heard that phrase, oh, she's never met a stranger? I do not identify as an extrovert. Some people will put that on me, but I do not claim that label for myself. But where I am 100% gifted is in the gift of people. I can go anywhere, meet anyone, and I will find one thing to connect with them on. I'm not good at shallow connections. I can't just like talk to you about the weather. More often than not, people talk to me about things that they may not have spoken to their family about or things that may not have spoken. It's just the way God has gifted me. People open up to me. So because of that, I make a lot of friends, and I make a lot of friends fast. And because I genuinely love people, I'm like, everyone, come into my intimate circle. I may not be quick to share things with people, but I'm very quick to take on other people's struggles and burdens and lift them up and encourage them and all this stuff. And that sounds great, right? Until it's not. Because guess what? You cannot navigate all those friendships meaningfully and deeply without boundaries. Without boundaries. So, another reason why it's important to be intentional with boundary settings and friendships is because it actually allows us to have deeper connections with people. Sometimes I've gotten closer to the friends where I've had to have uncomfortable conversations with than the ones I've never beefed with, or the ones I've never had to check or hold accountable. The ones where I've had to have accountability conversations and vice versa are the ones that feel deeper because we really wrestled through some things. Can you relate, Doc?
I can. I can definitely relate to it being uncomfortable to have those conversations, particularly the ones that are really meaningful to you because what if? And I think that is a lot many times the reason that we don't consider therapy is because what if we learn something and we have to act on it? So when you bring it to the forefront, then you have to decide, am I going to do something about this or not? You know, that's uncomfortable. So certainly, I think for me, that the big piece is we're afraid that we're going to lose the relationship. But if we don't have the uncomfortable conversations, then we walk, we grow in the bitterness area, and we actually lose the relationship anyway.
Yeah.
It becomes a slower loss of the relationship, and you don't get to have the meaningful relationship you could have if you start to have some of those difficult conversations early on.
Right. There are so many fears that actually are lies that come up with boundary setting when it comes to friendships. And we want to walk through that in a little bit. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about how do we even determine what type of boundaries that we set with friends? So, okay, we've sold you on the importance of boundaries, why we need them, why you need them, and why it overall benefits you when you can have a deeper relationship with a person and more self respect and confidence for yourself. But how do you know what type of boundaries that you need? I like to, again, if you were tuned in last week, I talked about this term called psychological safety, and it's really one that is used in the workplace. It was coined by a professor, Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School. And it really just talks about your ability to speak up and take risks without negative consequences in the workplace. But I believe that psychological safety can and should be applied to our friendships and our relationships in that regard. So when you take a self assessment and you ask yourself, psychologically, do I feel safe in this space with this person? And what does that mean? It doesn't always have to mean physical safety, although we'll touch on that, but I mean emotional safety. What this assessment looks like for me and has looked like, because man, y'all, this timeline of the conversation, I only share with you all what I have experienced and what I've put to the test so that you know what I'm speaking about is tried, tested, and true. So, psychological safety is an assessment that I've been running through my head with my friendships. And what I mean by that in terms of emotions is riddle yourselves these questions. When I'm with this friend and something good happens to me, do I feel the need to downplay it? Do I feel comfortable sharing that good news? Or when I'm with that friend and someone else gives me a compliment, do I find the way to be self deprecating and be like, oh no, girl, I got this at Target? Or just a way to downplay the compliment that maybe someone else has given me that that other friend is witnessing? Or do I feel safe to express my mistakes with that person? Or do I think, oh, they're going to keep score if I tell them this bad thing happened? They're going to bring it up in a later conversation because they've done that before. That's kind of part of the self assessment that I'm talking about when determining whether boundaries in that relationships need to be set, which they always do, but what the boundaries may look like. And before I go on with that, what are some other ways that people can start to determine what boundaries in their friendships could look like or should look like, Doc?
I will add to that self assessment. I pay attention to how my body feels when I
Mm,
leave you. Do I feel more peaceful?
mm,
Do I feel calmer? Do I feel more hopeful or optimistic? Or do I feel a sense of dread and worry and angst? How do I feel when I leave you? So I'm taking an inventory of what happens to me and my emotional wellness in our exchange. If you are someone who leaves me feeling joyful, or more optimistic, or like I can, run through mountains, I want to hang out with you more. But if you have crushed my faith and I feel more fearful, I want to dial that back a little bit more because, you know, um, in the multitude of counselors, there's safety, but there
mhm.
is contagious. There are feelings that can feel contagious. If you've ever walked into a room and the person was anxious and then you felt anxious, like
Yeah.
that's what I mean. So that's what I mean when I say that the self assessment piece. And then as we're talking about the how to set boundaries, I think you lead in love, and
Mm,
so you start with, this relationship is very important to me, and I want to give it um, the best chance at survival. And with that, and maybe not those words, but you lead with love. This is important to me, da 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 da. And I notice, and then you can just make an observation. I'm curious. How do you feel? Da 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 da. And it depends on what the boundary is that you're setting. But for me, I frequently start with questions when I'm having an uncomfortable conversation. For instance, I might ask my daughter, I'm curious. And when I lead with I'm curious. What did you think would happen when you told your friend that you hated her hair? Like now you're really upset that you're not, but like when you said she looked like a peacock with that hairstyle, what did you think was going to happen, right? So now I'm being a little bit silly here, but I'm curious. How did what did you want to happen from this exchange that happened with us? Like, were you and I don't want to assume that you were trying to hurt my feelings, but what what was your desired outcome?
I
Okay.
love this lead with love, and we're going to get into how to communicate our boundaries. But what you said about the self assessment has been playing in my head. How do you feel after you leave that person? What do you feel leaving them? And the reason I want to kind of sit with that some more is because a lot of the times in our relationships, when we're in a conversation with someone that we've been friends with for years, you kind of go with the flow and the energy that's always been there. And you could be laughing and maybe they kind of have a dig at you and you laugh along with them.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, how many times has this happened to you? It's not until after you leave the conversation and you go, huh, that you begin and are even able to process what you needed in that conversation, what didn't happen, and what did happen, which was a violation of a boundary that you've either spoken or you haven't yet spoken, or like you've mentioned, a boundary that you're just discovering.
Hmm.
And that's why that self assessment piece is so important in determining what kind of boundaries you need. I'll give another example. I was talking to a friend of years, and we got into an argument where I felt in that moment, I just had to apologize to keep the peace. And I felt like if I didn't apologize in this moment, everything will be ruined moving forward. It would be an uncomfortable experience. I just had to apologize. What I was apologizing for, couldn't tell you. But I felt the need to apologize just to smooth things over. And I take responsibility for apologizing without understanding what I need to apologize for. And, we apologized to each other. After I apologized and she was fine apologizing, we hashed it out, we hugged. And it wasn't until I was rehashing that conversation to my husband the next day that I actually cried when I was explaining it to him. Because my body went into survival mode. Like it's like you're talking about what you experience as children. Like I just needed to keep the peace. I needed to survive. I needed to make it out of that conversation by whatever means necessary. But then it wasn't until I left that my body was able to process and feel what it wasn't allowed to feel in that conversation because I was trying to survive the conversation. So I love what Dr. Rhonda said when we're talking about determining the boundaries we need is your self-assessment may not be in real time because during that conversation with your friend, you might feel fine, but it is okay if after the conversation, you do not feel fine and then you revisit it with that friend. And I don't know if there's anything else about that you want to talk about before we got into communicating our boundaries. But that was really important that you raised.
Yeah, and the thing about it is you talked about having to downplay a compliment, right? And that many times, I think it is an assessment of more about how confident they feel, right? It's not even necessarily about you. And so, but
Yeah.
I do pay attention to like that first 7 seconds when I tell you something amazing has happened to me. And like if you have that look of constipation, like immediately, but then you try to recover, like I noticed that, right? And I don't take it as that you're a bad person, but I interpret it as you likely are not happy with where you are right now,
Yeah.
and so you're struggling to be happy for me because you're not happy with you. And it used to be that I interpreted it as, you're a hater. And I don't take it like that anymore. Like, I mean, and it may be true, but that's not my first go to. You're a hater. It is, you're not at a place right now that you're happy with what's going on with you and you're struggling to be happy with me. And once I know that, it doesn't mean that I don't necessarily navigate our relationship anymore, but it means I navigate our relationship different. I
There
don't
we
put
go.
you in a scenario where you have to pretend to be happy for me, you
Yeah.
know? And I'm going to down back sharing that with you. I have very few people that I share my amazing things with. On my Facebook profile, I don't have all those glorious things because I'm not trying to hurt the people. My life is like, many times it's fantabulous, right? And I've seen, like, if I see that little over something small that I share with you, oh, you're not ready for the big time.
Yeah. What a gracious response, too. And it goes back to what you're talking about leading with love. We are giving examples. I mean, the ones that I've talked about so far are probably friendships that you should reconsider even calling them a friend. I love, again, what Dr. Anna brought up with your immediate response need not be they're a hater. I can't have them in my space.
Mhm.
It could very well be perhaps you're sharing pregnancy news and that friend is struggling with infertility issues, or maybe that friend has even experienced a miscarriage recently. It is entirely normal for them to respond with hesitancy or them to have difficulty navigating joy for you while they're navigating personal grief. I remember a friend who lost her parents, and I was talking about calling my mom, and I saw something in her face, but I knew it was because she was reminded of her own mother. So I didn't hold it against her. So when we're making these assessments, let's lead with grace. Let's also, though, be mindful in our assessments of patterns and practices, as we call it in civil rights. So you're going through a season of grief, and that season can span an indeterminate amount of time. At the same time, if you have a pattern and practice of downplaying an achievement of mine or not genuinely being happy for me, that's when I think it may be okay to be like, well, is this person really my friend? Because it's not just like a season of them being down, but they have rarely been able to support me or express that kind of joy. And a boundary in that case can look like you being discerning, as Dr. Rhonda said, about what you share with them. Well, let's talk about some determinations or assessments that maybe aren't as insidious as they secretly hate us or they're jealous of us. But how about just we need to set boundaries with our friends because you know what? It's a busy season at work, and my friends are still trying to kick it with me every Friday, every Saturday, every Sunday. You know, seasons of life and how that can inform our boundaries with friends. You want to talk about maybe it's not like an emotional thing, it's just like a season of life.
Mhm. Mhm. As you were talking about that those boundaries for me during COVID, I was the person who was not going out with others. Like I was not hanging out. I was working from home, and I felt very judged by my friends. And we were judging each other. For the record, I was judging them, and they were judging me. And
Honesty, honesty.
and so, but I realized that I was not operating in love. So I love to lead with love. The only person that could manipulate me, and I would know I was being manipulated, was my mother. All right. So
Mm.
I would know I'm being manipulated by guilt, and I am doing it because of guilt. Right. So that, yeah. But generally speaking, I lead with love. If I feel, if I'm doing something, I don't want to be doing something to be seen
Mm.
or for people to think I'm a certain way. I
Mm.
truly want to do stuff because of love. And so I realized that all of us were operating in fear. So some
Mm.
people were not getting the vaccine because they were afraid of the vaccine. Some people were not going out because they were afraid to go out. And some people were living their best lives. And for me, I realized I was resenting my friends because I was afraid for them. I didn't want to lose anybody else that I'd loved. I'd lost 3 people in 2 weeks, and I didn't want to lose another person. And so I was afraid for them. My interactions with them were grounded in fear. And so I
Mm.
was acting because I don't want to lose somebody else to stupidity. It was what was happening. You see how judgmental that sounds, right?
I mean,
So
it's honest. It's honest.
yes. And so they were like, oh, you don't have faith or whatever. And I didn't want to hear a single thing about faith. I have faith that I need to stay home. Okay. So we're having these conversations, and we're violating each other's boundaries going and coming, right? And so finally, I realized my resentment was growing at the, okay, we're not eating. I wanted to be invited even if I wasn't coming. Okay. So now I say all of this to say that when you are navigating your boundaries, sometimes you're doing it in real time. And
Yeah.
if you're not self assessing, like you said, you will be in the moment, in the flow, and not understand the reason that you're being motivated. So when I was able to step back and say, Rhonda, you lost your mom quickly. You're afraid. You're afraid because this was available to her and she chose not to do it and she got it too late and she died. You're afraid the same thing is going to happen to the people that you love. And so I had this conversation with my pastor because I was like upset with him. Like, what are you doing? I need you here. You're my last parent. you know? And so, but I'm navigating in real time. And when we're navigating in real time, we make mistakes.
Hmm. That's real.
And so you have to go back then and learn from it.
Mm.
And then you have communication grounded in your experience. Now, people say experience is the best teacher. No, 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 no. Experience is the most convincing teacher. The best teacher is you listening to us and then doing better. That's the best.
Mm.
Okay.
Oh, I love that. I love that. You spoke a lot about fear. And we were going to talk about some like hows of communication and boundaries, but I'm going to jump to fear and really getting at what keeps us from setting the boundaries we know we need to set with our friends. And why do we avoid this sometimes? I'm with you, Doc. I 100% think that fear is at the root of why we do not speak up and set the boundaries with our friends as we need to. And that fear could look like, I've been friends with this person for 15 years, and the underlying belief or fear that I hold is that if I speak up and I set a boundary for myself that I really need, they're going to stop being my friend. Or my fear is that if I set this boundary, if I talk about what I need, they may laugh at it or say I'm being too sensitive or I'm too vulnerable. Or my fear is that I don't deserve the boundary or the thing that I'm asking for. And that if I just toughen up, or if I just kind of lightened up, or if I made myself more available, if I were a better friend, I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't need to set that boundary to begin with. So let's look at fear and why you, Dr. Rana, think that it is so difficult for us to set or communicate. Because we may have them set in our heads and we
Mm-hmm.
may be holding people to those unspoken boundaries. Why is it hard to either set them or communicate them once we know we need them with friends?
Our history.
Ooh.
Previously, when we set boundaries, people said to us all those things you just said. You're too sensitive. You wear your heart on your sleeves. You need to toughen up. And when we established the boundaries in the past, they weren't respected. We were ridiculed.
Mm.
You know, when we established the boundaries in the past with our family, we were ousted. You might hear your loved one on the phone telling their sibling, "Yeah, can you believe what she said?" And so we have that, and we have this fear of rejection, this fear of abandonment, this fear of not being good enough. And we don't realize that if we share who we really are and they reject us, that rejection does not feel like a gift, but it is in fact a gift
Yeah.
because it's opening the door for them to leave you so that you can be who you truly are and
Mm.
you be the magnet for the people who will embrace that and celebrate it. I remember when we moved to Los Angeles, um, I am who I am, and I've just been that. I've grown up hearing all of my little life from my mother. Baby, act like you got some sense. Honey, I would act for like 45 seconds, and that was all the acting I could do. She wanted me to be like my brother. My brother was quiet, he was soft spoken, he followed instructions the first time. I, on the other hand, was, but why? But why? But I don't understand. And she didn't want any questions, she wanted blind obedience. And it's just not how I'm set up to be. I am a researcher now. I'm a radio show host now. I'm a podcaster. I am a psychiatrist. And it's because why is in my soul. It's in my right. But my mother tried to beat why out of me. She tried to manipulate why out of me. But why is who I am and is a part of my gift to the world. Right. And so when you set the boundary and they decide, I can't follow your boundary is too taxing for me, and they leave, it is a gift that feels like um, the world is ending, but
Yeah.
it is still a gift. I went to California. It was the first time in my entire life that I felt celebrated and like people got me. They weren't calling me saying she's a little white girl. Oh, she talks white. I didn't have to code shift. I just got to be, because in my mind, I'm black, big black, black. But in my friend's mind, I'm like a little white girl sometimes, at least my friends back then. And so I just got to be my Guns and Rose loving self. I got to I got to be my Aretha Franklin loving self. I got to be my Kanye loving self. I got to just like what I liked without judgment that I wasn't black enough, that I
Mm.
wasn't good enough or whatever. You know what I mean? And
100%.
and I thrived. California was the best place I've ever lived, at least in my mind then, because that is a place where people just let me be without judgment. And that's what I want in my relationships. I want to be without judgment. And that does not mean without accountability,
Yes.
you know, but I want you to love me enough to hold me accountable. But I want you to like me enough to, even if you're judging me, say, I'm judging you right now, but, and let me just be.
Yeah.
And you don't have to let me just be. I'm going to be, but I may not be with you.
Yes. I mean, if y'all aren't dancing in your seat, I don't know what you're doing. Because that was just an entire sermon that I know I'm going to look back and watch. You know what's real fascinating about some of these college friends is we move to different cities, we move to different places, and you realize that you come into your own in a way that you couldn't discover otherwise. And another good assessment on whether you need to discuss boundaries or create distance is when you are back with those friends. And not that you like wow out. I mean, look, I support letting loose personally, but more that you feel like you can't also be who you've progressed and developed to be because you got to go back. You're getting pulled back.
Yes, everything she said right there. Let's just pause. Don't go any further. Let's just say right there and sit with that. When you go back, do you then have to deliver a reduced version of yourself in order for you all to be okay?
Yes.
And if that is what you're having to do, it's truly not okay.
It's not okay. And again, this is different than going back at homecoming and you end up taking maybe one too many cocktails because you want to, but feeling like you have to dilute yourself in order to maintain that relationship. Again, these are the questions I've had to ask myself. That is the fear, right? That is what keeps you from setting and communicating the boundaries. We want to speak to that fear. This idea that if I speak up and I say, I'm actually not into that, or I don't like it when you speak to me that way, even though they've spoken to you that way for 15, 16, 17, 18 decades. And say, actually, I don't like it when you speak to me that way.
And I never liked it when you spoke to me
And I've
like that.
never liked it. And it's okay that I'm bringing it up now. It's like, well, why didn't you bring it up before? I'm realizing that now. That's also okay. The fear or the underlying thing keeping you from saying that could very well be, but then we won't be friends. But I love what Dr. Rhonda said is that your friend? Is that your friend? And the cost of keeping that person in your life far outweighs the price that you are already paying on living a diluted, diminished version of yourself.
That right there is tweetable for those of you. That statement right there is why you should share this episode right there. Put a pin in that.
It is way more expensive to live a diluted version of yourself than to not have that person in your life. And I love that we're getting real about this conversation because it sounds so nice, setting boundaries with your friends and blah, blah, blah. Baby, it's going to hurt.
It sucks.
When I set boundaries more recently, it took me, I'm not kidding, 2 weeks to recover. 2 weeks. I was literally having like nightmares of that conversation because I ended up losing the thing I thought I was going to lose. But it birthed a series like this, where I can speak to you all, where we can speak to you all from actual experience. And it birthed a recognition of the community I have around me, where Dr. Rhonda literally calls me and says, you tell me what you want to celebrate, and we're celebrating it. I don't care if it's big, I don't care if it's small, we're celebrating it. So the fear is always more amplified in your mind than what the reality is. And your worst case scenario could come true and you lose that person. But man, to gain yourself. And also, I want to talk about what my therapist actually told me. She said, you're not loving that person well when you're not setting boundaries. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm preserving the relationship, I'm afraid of hurting their feelings if I say I actually don't like it when you call me this, or I'm preserving, you're not loving that person well because iron sharpens iron. And we're in each other's lives to develop each other and to help advance each other. And if you're not holding that person accountable, you're actually harming them. along with yourself. But a lack of accountability is actually a lack of love because they need to be held accountable for the things that they do that are harmful or just not pleasant. What
Yeah,
on them?
something right there.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I think that we don't have difficult conversations is because there are some messages that we grow up hearing. And one of the ones is most salient for me is if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all.
Mm.
So we interpret that as if I have a tough conversation with you, that is the truth, then that's not nice. And so I'm trying not to say it. And what I will say to you is tell the truth in love, but I would much rather my husband say to me something, you know, when we're out, you monopolize the whole conversation, girl. Let those folks have something to say. I would rather my husband say that to me in love and me hear that than for the people that I'm out with to say to each other, "Oh my God, she talks too much," and they never tell me, and then they don't want to go out with me anymore. And I have no idea, what it is. I would rather Joyce tell me something that I need to hear privately in love so that other thousands of people who are out there listening to me are not talking about it, and then it hinders my opportunities later because somebody didn't have a tough conversation with me that was uncomfortable for them to deliver, but they delivered it because they loved me and they didn't want me out there in those streets looking crazy. I'm not crazy, but
What? They delivered it because they love you. So, more often than not, your friends actually do want to hear what your boundaries are and they do want to be held accountable. It may hurt our ego a little bit initially, it may be a little hard to hear, but ultimately, the people in your community, the people in your tribe, they want to hear it. And it will hurt them more to know that you have been annoyed or bothered by this thing and you just never told us. Tell your
listen, first of all, I don't want to know, but I need to know. But I'm going to tell you, somebody told me something one time, and I can't even remember what it was, but it was something that I had done 3 years earlier. And she waited 3 years to tell me. And it was something that obviously I didn't think was a big deal, but it was like when she was telling me about it, she was back in the place, living it. And I didn't even remember it happening. It hadn't hit my radar because of course if I think it would hurt your feelings, I wouldn't do it. But I said to her, I've probably done like that like a gazillion times since then. Why didn't you tell me then? Then I could have made the choice
Yeah.
to not put you in a situation or whatever it was that I said. But 3 years later, like, what do you think you're not telling me for 3 years? Now you really resent me. And I'm thinking, if I've been doing this for 3 years for someone else, I've been compromising all of my relationships for 3 years.
After you heard that, though, what was your response if you're able to share? If it's like a teachable thing. So, like, you,
I don't really remember, like, I don't remember the specific issue. I only remember 3 years. But what I do know is that I continued to have the relationship, but I then was more mindful of that. And I tried to not do whatever it was, you know, that offended her. And then the people that I had other relationships with, I checked in on them to see if that was truly offensive to them as well.
yeah.
Right?
And that's the thing is sometimes it does take 3 years to get to that. And I know some friends who are like, you didn't tell me 3 years ago, it doesn't matter now. And they'll punish you for not bringing it up sooner. But sometimes, like you said, we don't know what we need until later. So I appreciate that your ultimate response was, let me check myself. That is love. That is love, not what you first feel. You may be like, why didn't she tell me? That's honest too.
That was definitely my first feeling. Like, oh, what are you doing?
And we are human first reactions. That
Yeah.
is normal. But it's like, well, then what? It's the then what. And we are coming to the end of our time, but I want to get into the how to communicate. I know we can go on and on because it's such an important topic, but how to communicate. You know, humans communicate non-verbally and verbally. Um, so let's say you've been listening to this and there's a tough conversation where either you not only don't feel emotionally safe, you may feel physically unsafe with that person. That person may have a bad temper. We'll see that more in kind of like intimate relationships we'll talk about in October. But you can have a friend who's just a friend who's like physically or emotionally abusive. How do you communicate that given those considerations? Or what if it's just that friend chews real loudly and drives me nuts, or I'm married now and this friend texts me after 10 p.m. How do you communicate your boundaries once you realize what they are, that they're important, that you need them?
For me, it is about there is a process that I do before the day of, and the first thing is that I want to be prayerful,
Yeah.
right? Um, because I want wisdom in how I navigate that, and I'm prayerful about when I say it. You don't say it after somebody's just got home from work or they just lost someone, and so I'm mindful of when I choose to have a conversation. And many times I have thought through what I'm going to say because I want to lead in love. Ultimately, I think about my goals. Are my goals to preserve the relationship? Are my goals to change the person? And I don't need to change you, but I need to change our relationship, right?
Mhm.
So our relationship around this issue needs to change. And so, I will lead with, I value our relationship. It's really important to me. And there is something that has bothered me, and I wanted to check myself beforehand. And so, da 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 da. So that may be one way. The other way, sometimes that I'll do is I will ask questions. I will be curious, and it just kind of depends on what the issue is. But I love to lead in love, and then I want to come back and check in on it. Did I Was that offensive?
Mhm.
You know, and I sometimes will say I don't mean to be intrusive. This is something that is important to me. And I think that as we navigate our relationship in the future, I need to make sure that I've shared that with you because I actually have not shared how I feel with you, feel about this with you, right? So I have some phrases that are common denominators in my discussions, um, just depending on what the specific area is.
I love those phrases. I love, first of all, being prayerful so that, again, we're leading with our emotions because our emotions are divine, God given, and we're also weaving in the discernment so that we aren't speaking a mistake or something we want to take back. So I love this contemplation of when and how you prepare
Mhm.
before you have the conversation. And I love leading with love. And leading with love does not necessarily mean that this person has violated boundaries or has been disrespectful, so I must reconcile with them.
Mm.
Reconciliation and boundary setting are different. It is totally okay to love someone from afar. We're
Yes.
not saying that you got to cut somebody off, but like Dr. Rhonda said, I'm not here to change you, I'm here to change the relationship.
Mm.
And along with losing friends, I've also just had to redefine the terms of my friendships,
Yeah.
realizing this person is in a funk and is in a season, and I can't be with her in the trenches in the way that she may want me to be because it is actually toxic to me. So I'm going to be over here, check in
Mhm.
on her when I'm able to, but no longer prioritize every day, not my intimate circle. If you look at the life of Jesus, he had the 12, and he had an even smaller circle than the 12 with him that he brought to the Garden of Gethsemane. It is okay to have levels of intimacy with your platonic relationships. Not everyone can be in your inner circle. And in fact, not everyone should be in your inner circle. Be mindful of those boundaries because it may not mean cutting off, it just may mean pushing them down a few rungs of the tree, right?
Yeah. And you have to understand that there are certain relationships that may be triggering for you. I
Yeah.
remember my mother died from cancer. And and after that, I really paid a lot of attention to people who had losses. And so if you lost a mother, if you lost da 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 da, I was really checking in on you. And I remember a really dear friend of mine, her daughter developed cancer, and I could not be there for her.
Mm.
It was baffling. So, like, I was guilty myself, but I truly just, I could not be there for her. I could not do the checking in. And I realized at some point that, and this is, I know this is going to sound like strange, but it was like I was mad at God for letting this amazing human get cancer and didn't, and I hadn't processed it. And I wasn't thinking, oh no, God put him on it, put the cancer on him or anything like that. But I was just like, what in the world, you know? And so my theology was a little bit off, but it also impacted how I was able to navigate that relationship. And the lady was just like, "Oh no, you know, you were checking on me," but she didn't know how I normally checked on people, right? So I was checking in, but I wasn't doing it to the level that I would do it and the way I would do it. And so, you know, understand that sometimes things will happen in relationships that will trigger you and set you back to and take you to places that you don't want to go. And that's why it's so important to have a therapist, number one. And journaling is very therapeutic for the soul, because journaling what you're going to say or how things make you feel can really help you liberate emotionally as well. Because when it's jumbled in our head, it's chaotic. But when we can get it on paper, or we can get it into a prayer, or we can have a conversation about it, it feels a lot less heavy.
I appreciate everything that you shared, and I appreciate that practical push. We're going to get to some more practical pushes at the end of this segment. But first, I just want to thank you for being on the show. Everyone, please, another virtual round of applause for Dr. Rhonda. Share this segment. It has been impactful for me, so I trust that it's going to be impactful for those watching. And if you have a friend who you think can watch it or use it, a family member, a coworker, this applies to literally everyone on earth, because everyone at least has one relationship, friendship that they're navigating. So share, share, share. Thank you, Dr. Rhonda.
My
And
pleasure.
I also want to preview what is coming up, and that is boundaries in our romantic relationship come October. I have a special guest who's typically behind the scenes, but he is not going to be behind the scenes for that series. I am so excited to just get some more of like a male perspective, because that is also valuable in this space. And I hope to see you all in October. Also, if you have one-on-one intimate questions that you may not want to share on the public chat, again, come thrive 24/7 at gmail.com. You can follow up with me one-on-one, and I'm more than happy to navigate this conversation about boundaries with you one-on-one. Thank you again, Dr. Rhonda. I cannot wait to connect with you further. But for now, we're going to go to the practical pushes of this segment. Stay tuned. So now it's time for how we can make everything we've discussed today more concrete and more practical. I want to go back to how we communicate our boundaries. So, boundaries can be communicated in writing. Maybe you're in a situation with a friend where you don't feel emotionally safe. Maybe you feel like they're going to yell at you, throw things. It is perfectly okay to communicate those boundaries in a letter, in an email, just anywhere where you feel like you will not be cut off, where you will not be harmed, and where you will not expose yourself to kind of emotional toxicity. Protect yourself as you're setting your boundaries. But let's say it's a boundary where you want to maintain the friendship, you totally feel safe, but there are some things that you want to address and hold that person to account. I personally advise in person conversations if you can do it. Set a time after you've checked in with yourself, after you've meditated or prayed and gotten your spirit right, so that you can communicate those boundaries effectively. Over 90% of our communication is nonverbal. So it's important that when you're boundary setting, that person can see your hands, see your eyes, understand your posture when you're coming from. And it may help your friend receive the boundaries that you're setting with more grace, and more love. I also want to remind you that when we're thinking about boundaries, don't think about what you're shutting out. Boundaries are actually a way for you to keep certain things in. My therapist mentioned something so powerful. Think of boundaries as I'm keeping in my mental peace, I'm keeping in self respect, I'm keeping in consistency, loyalty, joy. And that is what a boundary allows you to do. It allows you to love that friend well. And more importantly, it allows you to love yourself well. We're called to love our neighbors as ourselves. Loving yourself is really the root of boundary setting because it helps you love others better. With that being said, I hope you all practice setting boundaries as needed, and I hope you thrive. Thanks for joining.